Good morning, everyone. Today we have a Dhamma talk by Bhante Suddhaso, and we are talking about the Buddhist practice before enlightenment.
Okay. So I'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas, and then, as usual, I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations as we go along, and then I'll take any questions you have at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. This morning we'll be looking at Majjhima Nikaya number 19, the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, so the sutta on two kinds of thought. So this is one of the great classics in the Pali Canon. Of course, the Pali Canon is full of wonderful discourses, but this one is particularly well-liked because it talks about the Buddha's own practice while he was trying to attain awakening. So it's important always to keep in mind that the Buddha was not always the Buddha, that the Buddha used to be just like us. The Buddha used to be an ordinary, unenlightened person, just like the rest of us. And in fact, in his various past lives, the Buddha lived as every kind of being imaginable. Sometimes he was a woman, sometimes he was a man, sometimes he was a human, sometimes an animal, sometimes a deva, sometimes a ghost. So the Buddha lived all the kinds of lives that we live. He had all the same experiences that we have. And he had all of the same difficulties and defilements and delusions that we have as well. And it was through the strength of his own committed, dedicated, ongoing practice that he was able to overcome those difficulties and attain enlightenment. So the reason why it's so important to reflect on this is because sometimes when we think about the Buddha, we think about the Buddha as this impossibly distant, pure being, totally unlike ourselves. But that's not correct. It's not correct to think in that way. It's correct to remember that the Buddha started off just like us. And he went through exactly the same things that we're going through now. And he was able to overcome those things and to attain awakening, which means we can as well. We have the ability to follow the footsteps of the Buddha and attain exactly the same perfection that he attained. So this particular discourse, the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, it's very relevant to this because it talks about how the Buddha was struggling in his spiritual practice. He was struggling with defilements and delusions. But through his own wise contemplation, he was able to strategize a way of overcoming those problems. So I'll go ahead and read through the discourse at this time. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Savatthi and Jeta's Grove in Anathapindika's park. There the Blessed One addressed the monks. Monks! Auspicious sir, those monks replied to the Blessed One. The Blessed One said this. Monks, before my awakening, when I was an unenlightened bodhisattva, this thought occurred to me. What if I were to abide continually dividing my thoughts into two categories? Monks, any thought of sensuality, aversion, or cruelty I put in one category. Any thought of renunciation, non-aversion, and non-cruelty I put in the second category. So this is the practice the Buddha was doing at the time. So this applies particularly during meditation practice, but you can also do the same thing when engaged in any other activity, which is to watch the thoughts that arise in your mind and to divide those thoughts into two categories. So in one category, you have thoughts related to sensual desire, thoughts related to aversion, so any kind of resistance towards an experience or dislike of an experience, and thoughts of cruelty, so wanting any being to suffer or be unhappy. That includes yourself, by the way. So any kind of thought of wanting yourself to be unhappy would fit under cruelty. So that includes wallowing in self-pity or self-hatred. Those are all thoughts of cruelty. That's not humility, that's just cruelty. Cruelty towards yourself is just as bad as cruelty towards anybody else. And the second category is thoughts of renunciation. So that's nekkhamma in Pali. Renunciation is one of these extremely critical central concepts in Buddhist practice. So renunciation is the practice of putting things down. It's the practice of letting go of our feeling of needing things, letting go of our deep-seated delusion that we need external things in order to be happy. But renunciation goes farther than just letting go of external things. It also extends to letting go of internal things as well. So letting go of emotions, letting go of ideas, letting go of perceptions, letting go of self-identities. This is actually a very important one. So we tend to have all kinds of identities of who we think we are. We think I'm a man or I'm a woman, I'm gay or I'm straight, I'm short or I'm tall, I'm ugly or I'm cute, I'm smart or I'm stupid. Like, we have all these self-identities. But from a Buddhist standpoint, all of those self-identities are utterly absurd. They're completely meaningless. So we're also putting down all of our self-identities, recognizing that none of that is who we really are. None of that is our true self. It's all just temporary conditions. And renunciation ultimately is putting down all defilement, delusion, and self-identity altogether. So completely relinquishing all of our distorted concepts of reality, all of our misconceptions. Then the other two are non-aversion and non-cruelty. So this I find interesting, in that you would expect the Buddha to say something like kindness and compassion or equanimity or something along those lines, something in a positive formulation. But instead he simply says non-aversion and non-cruelty. And one reason I find this notable is because it's a bit more accessible. It's like, okay, having infinite compassion for all sentient beings, that can sound a little remote and distant, but can I at least not be cruel? Can I at least not be aversive? I think I can do that. That's not too distant. So it's setting the bar a little bit lower, a little bit easier for us. So we don't necessarily need to aim at utter perfection right now, but we can at least stop producing unwholesome mind states for the time being. So of course, optimally, non-aversion and non-cruelty, optimally that would mean infinite, all-embracing compassion. That is, in fact, a Buddhist virtue that we try to cultivate. But at a bare minimum, we try to just have a mind which is free of cruelty, which is free of aversion. So the Buddha continues, talking about his practice. He says, "Monks, while I was abiding in this way, vigilant, ardent, and resolute, a sensual thought arose in me. I understand it in this way. A sensual thought has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, and to the affliction of both. It destroys wisdom, brings irritation, and does not lead to Nirvana." So this is one of the ways that we deal with unwholesome thoughts arising in the mind. In the Vitakka Sutta, which is the next discourse after this one, the Buddha gives 5 ways of dealing with distracting or unwholesome thoughts, unwanted thoughts during meditation. And one of them is reflecting on the drawbacks and disadvantages of those thoughts. So that's what the Buddha is doing here. He notices that when thoughts of sensuality would arise in his mind, he'd recognize, oh, these thoughts, they lead to my own affliction. They make me unhappy right now. And these thoughts of sensuality inspire me to do more self-destructive things. They might inspire me to go out in search of sensual indulgences. So giving up my spiritual practices for a time. In the pursuit of sensuality, I might even engage in unwholesome conduct like lying or stealing or even killing. It might lead me to use intoxicants or to engage in sexual misconduct. And these are also things that lead to the affliction of others. So especially lying, stealing, killing, cheating, and so on. These are all things that harm other people as well as ourselves. And the Buddha points out that when we're rolling around in sensuality, it destroys our wisdom. So wisdom is knowing that everything is temporary and ultimately unsatisfying. But when we're indulging in sensual thoughts, then we're actually cultivating the opposite idea. We're cultivating the idea that happiness can be found through getting sensual experiences. We're deliberately ignoring the temporary and unsatisfying nature of sensual experiences. So we're cultivating the delusion that happiness can be found through sensuality. So this is the opposite of wisdom. It's foolishness. So indulging in sensual thoughts destroys our wisdom. And he says it brings irritation. This also is something you can notice for yourself. So when you're sitting there desperately craving something, so maybe you're desperately craving Neapolitan pizza, or you're desperately craving sexual activity, or you're desperately craving binge watching your favorite show. Well, what does that desperate craving feel like? Setting aside the object of your desire, because it actually doesn't matter at all. What does the desire itself feel like? It feels really uncomfortable. It feels kind of like burning ants crawling in your veins. It's not a pleasant experience. It feels kind of like a ball of hot needles under your skin. It feels like boiling steam inside your head. Like it's not a comfortable experience to be overcome with this burning desire for sensuality. So paying attention to the irritation and discomfort caused by the desire itself is another thing that can cause that desire to fade away. And finally, he has the reflection. This does not lead to Nirvana. So Nirvana is full enlightenment. It's the attainment of ultimate happiness and peace. It's the attainment of supreme, sublime, infinite, eternal bliss. So the Buddha's like, well, okay, so we have sensual pleasures, which actually are kind of nice. There's no denying they're kind of nice. But compared to the ultimate, infinite, eternal, sublime peace and happiness and bliss of Nirvana, I think I'll take the Nirvana. That sounds about 100 million thousand times better. Like infinitely better, literally, than any sensual experience. So reflecting, as long as I'm indulging in these sensual thoughts, I'm not getting any closer to enlightenment. In fact, I'm drifting farther away from it. So the Buddha says that by doing these reflections, so by reflecting, it leads to my own affliction, then the sensual thought disappeared. Reflecting, it leads to the affliction of others, the sensual thought disappeared. So the first one is compassion for yourself. The second one is compassion for others. Then by reflecting, it leads to the affliction of both, the thought disappeared. So this is compassion without division between self and other. Selfless compassion. By reflecting, it destroys wisdom, brings irritation, and does not lead to nirvana. The thought disappeared. So again, applying these three contemplations, that by indulging in sensual thought, we're weakening our wisdom, irritating ourselves, and drifting away from enlightenment. Just thinking about it, my mind just gets a little bit fed up. It's like, well, why would I want to do that to myself? That sounds horrible. So the Buddha says, monks, I abandoned, removed, and destroyed all arisen sensual thoughts. So this also is important. So the Buddha, he's saying that he didn't tolerate the presence of those thoughts because he saw that they were destructive and harmful. So he did what he could to get rid of them. So through using these contemplations, again, this is the practice of contemplating the danger, the drawback of unwholesome thoughts. And it says he did the same thing with any kind of aversive thought or any kind of cruel thought. So aversiveness, aversive thoughts, thoughts of aversion. This can be something like, I don't like this, I don't like the sound of that dehumidifier, I don't like the temperature in the room, it's too cold, it's too hot, I don't like the sensation in my body, I don't like that rumbling in my stomach, or I don't like the feeling of this fabric, or I don't like, fill in the blank. It doesn't really matter what it is that you don't like. The point is to notice the aversive thought. The aversive thought is an affliction to yourself. It makes you uncomfortable when you're having the thought. And it makes you grumpy, which means you're not very nice to the people around you. And it destroys your wisdom. So aversion is the opposite of peace. It's the opposite of equanimity. And it's cultivating, once again, the idea that our happiness is dependent upon conditions outside of our control. I can't really do too much about the weather. It's just the weather. I can't actually do that much about this body either. I try to keep it in good health, but despite my best efforts, it's not perfect. Bodies, by their very nature, are subject to poor health. That's just what bodies do. So reflecting on the inevitability of unpleasant and uncomfortable experiences, then we can start to have peace around them. We can start to have the wisdom of acceptance, the wisdom of endurance, the wisdom of patience, the wisdom of tolerance and acceptance and forbearance. And again, these aversive thoughts, they don't lead to nirvana. So enlightenment necessitates the complete acceptance of reality exactly as it is. Accepting that every single part of samsara is an irremovable part of samsara, and a necessary component of reality. You cannot remove anything from samsara. Samsara, by its very nature, contains every possible formation, every possible condition. So in order to attain awakening, we have to be willing to accept that every single possible condition, every single possible formation is a part of samsara. It's a part of reality. It's something which cannot be avoided, can only be accepted and endured. And thoughts of cruelty. So similarly, whether we want other people to suffer or we want ourselves to suffer, either way, it's just wanting to increase the suffering in the world. It's wanting beings to suffer, which is the exact opposite of the mind of awakening. So the mind of awakening is generated through wishing for beings to be free of suffering. Even if you just want yourself to be free of suffering, that's already a huge step in the right direction. Because in order to stop suffering, you also need to wish for others to stop suffering as well. Ultimately, we drop the separation between my suffering and the suffering of others. And it's just wishing for suffering to end, without a distinction of whether it's my suffering or somebody else's suffering. Then the Buddha makes an extremely important statement. So he says, whatever a monk frequently thinks about and considers becomes the inclination of his mind. So in Pali, bahulang anuvitaketi anuvichareti, tatatatang nati hoti chetaso. So whatever you frequently think about, whatever you frequently consider, whatever you're doing with your mind a lot, that becomes the tendency of the mind. That becomes its habit. That becomes the basic character and disposition of your mind. So this is an important statement because it indicates that we're not the victims of our own mind. We are the architects of our own mind. Again, a standard example, and I bring this up over and over again because no matter how much I bring it up, people like to pretend I don't say this. Why does music play in your head when you're meditating? Because you listen to music when you're not meditating. You're so constantly pointing your mind towards music that of course your mind is going to be constantly inclining towards music. If you want your mind to stop playing music while you're trying to meditate, well then stop playing music when you're not meditating. Very simple. Stop listening to music. I keep saying this over and over again, but people keep listening to music. It just blows my mind. Stop listening to music. Your meditation will improve dramatically. It makes a huge difference. But also just whatever you think about in general. If you're a writer and you spend all your time thinking about the plot lines and characters that you're writing, then what do you think is going to happen when you're meditating? You're going to keep thinking about those characters and plot lines. That's what you're going to do. Of course, that's because that's what you've been training your mind to do. You've been training your mind to come up with stories and characters and think about them all the time. So that's what it'll do. On the other hand, if you're always thinking about the Dhamma, what sort of thoughts are going to constantly be arising in your mind? Thoughts of Dhamma. If you're always reading the suttas and reflecting on the suttas, then what's going to be going on in your mind? Well, instead of playing constant replays of Britney Spears, instead your mind's going to be playing constant replays of the Buddha. And I can tell you which one I would rather have playing in my mind. You might have different preferences on this one, but let me tell you this. The words of Britney Spears do not lead to enlightenment. So I'll take the Buddha on this one. I actually don't even know if she's still popular. She was popular when I was a kid. Is she still popular? Okay, apparently she's still popular. It's hard to tell because my pop culture references are all about 20 years out of date. So, the Buddha says, if a monk frequently thinks about and considers sensual thoughts, then thoughts of renunciation are abandoned, sensual thoughts become frequent, and his mind inclines towards sensual thoughts. So this is not surprising. If you're constantly thinking about the pleasure that you can get through sensual experiences, then you're not going to be thinking about renunciation. And you're not going to be thinking about the happiness and peace and contentment that come through renunciation. So your mind will constantly incline towards sensuality. The habits of thinking about sensuality, the habits of craving sensual experiences, will just keep getting stronger and stronger. And you'll have less and less interest in renunciation. And similarly with aversive thoughts and cruel thoughts. When you're constantly thinking about how much you hate everything, then it's going to be very difficult for you to have a peaceful mind. It's going to be very difficult for you to have equanimity. It's going to be very difficult for you to be calm and non-reactive. Similarly, if you're constantly thinking about hurting people, then your mind will be far from compassion. In fact, your mind will constantly be rolling around in these dark, painful, miserable states. These states of harming. These states of pain and misery and torment. So if you think about inflicting torment on others, then you yourself will be constantly in a state of mental anguish. And then the Buddha gives a simile. He says, monks, it is like the last month of the rainy season at the beginning of autumn, when fields are crowded with crops, and a cow herder is herding cows. Using a stick, he fends off, forces back, obstructs, and keeps those cows away from that field of crops. For what reason? Monks, it is because the cow herder sees that it would be a cause of execution, imprisonment, fining, or reprimand. In the same way, monks, I saw the drawback, degradation, and defilement of unwholesome mind states, and the blessing of renunciation and the factor of purification of wholesome mind states. So here he gives the simile. So it's like when it's getting towards the end of the growing season, so farmers would have fields full of crops that were ready for harvest, and you're herding cows. Well, if you're not careful, then your cows will just do what their habit is to do, which is to go off and find something pleasant to eat, which happens to be those fields full of ripe crops, ripe vegetables. They'll just wander right in and just eat whatever they want. So if your herd is destroying somebody else's crops, you're the one who's responsible. You're the one who's going to get into legal trouble. And I find it interesting that we get a little glimpse into the legal system of ancient India at that time and place, where apparently if your farm animals eat somebody else's crops, that could be a serious enough crime that you could be executed. So apparently this was a very big deal back in those days. So the Buddha is saying, like, just as you don't want to let your farm animals get out of hand because it might lead to you getting executed for your crimes, you should have that same attitude towards your own thoughts. You don't want your thoughts to get out of hand because it can lead to deadly suffering for yourself as well as for others. So, and again, he points out that he saw the drawback, degradation, and defilement of unwholesome mind states. So recognizing how these unwholesome mind states make ourselves suffer. They're polluting our mind. It's kind of like somebody who likes to be clean and fresh and well-dressed, but then they're constantly smearing mud on themselves. It's like, well, what are you doing? It's completely insane. That's what we're doing with our mind. Like, we're constantly smearing dirt on our own mind and then wondering why it's not very clean, why it's not very pleasant. But the blessing of renunciation. So recognizing that the mind of renunciation is a mind of contentment and happiness. It's an unshakable mind, an invincible mind. Because the mind of renunciation does not rely upon anything whatsoever for its happiness. So that happiness cannot be taken away. It cannot be disturbed. So then the Buddha gives the opposite. So the first one was how he would deal with unwholesome mind states. The next one is, he says, while I was abiding in this way, vigilant, ardent, and resolute, a thought of renunciation arose in me. And he understood in this way, a thought of renunciation has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both. It nurtures wisdom, eliminates irritation, and leads to Nibbana. And he says, monks, even if I thought about and considered that thought at night, I saw no danger with that as its cause. Even if I thought about and considered that thought during the day, I saw no danger with that as its cause. Even if I thought about and considered that thought during both night and day, I saw no danger with that as its cause. So in other words, when contemplating thoughts of renunciation, and he gives the same reflection for non-aversion and non-cruelty. So when contemplating renunciation, he recognized that this is completely harmless. It doesn't hurt me and it doesn't hurt anybody else. So thinking about the happiness of non-attachment, that's what renunciation means, the happiness of non-attachment. It means I don't hurt myself and I don't hurt others. It cultivates wisdom, it eliminates irritation, and it leads to enlightenment. So he says there's no danger whatsoever in thinking about renunciation, in reflecting on the happiness and blessings that come through non-attachment. So even spending a whole day and a whole night just thinking about renunciation, he said, is a completely worthwhile, beneficial, and blameless activity. But the Buddha continues. He says, however, when I thought about and considered for too long, my body became tired. When the body is tired, the mind is disturbed. A disturbed mind is far from concentration. Monks, I internally settled, relaxed, focused, and concentrated my mind. For what reason? May my mind not be disturbed. So what he's talking about here is that when we're constantly engaging in insight meditation, so constantly reflecting on the Dhamma, constantly trying to come to a deeper understanding of the Dhamma, that's a very wholesome activity, but it can make us tired. It can exhaust us if that's all that we're doing. So we need to refresh the mind, stabilize the mind, steady the mind, and focus the mind. And we do that through practicing samadhi. It's also necessary to sleep enough, by the way. This is good to keep in mind. You do actually need to sleep every now and then. But it's also extremely important to cultivate samadhi, to practice concentration, mental unification, and stabilization. Without sufficient samadhi, it's impossible to develop deep wisdom. So then the Buddha, he again emphasizes whatever a monk thinks about and considers becomes the inclination of his mind. And he says, if one frequently thinks about and considers thoughts of renunciation, then sensual thoughts are abandoned, thoughts of renunciation become frequent, and one's mind inclines towards thoughts of renunciation. So again, if we're constantly reflecting on the blessings and benefits of renunciation, then we're less likely to fall into those thoughts of sensuality that the Buddha previously saw were just disturbing and afflicting and agitating his mind. Those sensual thoughts which were just pulling him farther from awakening. So instead we think about the blessings of non-attachment, the joy and happiness of tolerance and patience. And then the mind becomes more and more peaceful. It enjoys those thoughts more and more. And it spends more and more time dwelling in renunciation rather than in desire. And again, the same with thoughts of non-aversion and non-cruelty. And then he gives another simile relating to herding cows. So those of us who grew up in cities may find agricultural metaphors a bit distant from us. So it's good to keep in mind that throughout the vast majority of human history, most people have been engaged in agriculture. Most people have been farmers or herders of one sort or another. It's only in recent times that the majority of people are not farmers. So it's actually a major shift in human culture in the last couple hundred years, that suddenly most people are not farmers. So the Buddha often used agricultural similes, partly because they're extremely relevant to Buddhist practice, but also because these were things that the vast majority of people would instantly understand. So the Buddha gives another simile. He says, this is when someone has cultivated the wholesome thoughts of renunciation, non-aversion, and non-cruelty until they become the dominant tendency of mind. So he says, monks, it is like the last month of the hot season when all the crops have been brought into the villages and a cow herder is herding cows. While sitting at the root of a tree or in the open air, he only needs to maintain mindfulness that the cows are there. In the same way, monks, there only needed to be mindfulness that mind states are there. So the simile here is, after all those crops have been harvested, then it doesn't matter where your cows wander, because they're not going to destroy anybody's crops. There's nothing to worry about. There's no danger. So you can just relax. You can just relax under a tree and kick back. You don't need to worry about anything. You just need to have a general awareness that your cows are somewhere nearby. But you don't really need to worry too much about what they're getting up to because you know it's harmless. In fact, at that point, it's even beneficial. So the cows wandering through the farmer's fields will fertilize the soil. So your neighboring farmers, instead of being angry that your cows are destroying their crops, your neighboring farmers might actually be happy that your cows are giving them free fertilizer. So this is when your mind has been constantly habituated to thinking wholesome thoughts. Then it's harmless to let your thoughts wander a little bit because they're only going to wander in wholesome ways. So you can just relax, rest in the purity of the mind. You don't need to constantly struggle and fight with your mind. This is another thing that people often talk about in meditation. They talk about how meditation can feel like this constant battle. Like they're constantly fighting with their mind, constantly trying to wrestle their mind down and stop all these horrible thoughts. And it's like, well, why do you think all those horrible thoughts are there in the first place? Who put those thoughts there? Who continues to put those thoughts there? Who continues to nourish and build up those horrible thoughts? I'll give you a hint. It's you. Okay, that wasn't really a hint. I just gave you the answer. But we need to be completely realistic with ourselves. Why is our mind a horrible, nightmarish minefield of destructive thoughts? It's our own damn fault. That's why. We keep doing that to ourselves. We keep making a mess out of our own mind. And that's why it's such a mess. We keep developing these bad habits of unwholesome thoughts. And that's why our meditation practice is such a struggle. Again, like the first metaphor where the cow herder has to constantly fight with the cows to keep them out of the neighboring fields. That's what meditation is like when we have strong habits of unwholesome thoughts. But as we keep developing habits of wholesome thoughts, and we keep relinquishing and dropping and eliminating the harmful thoughts, then eventually you get to a point where you don't need to fight with your mind anymore because you've trained your mind to only do wholesome things. So then you can just relax and let the mind be pure. You can let the mind purify itself. So then the Buddha continues. He says, "Monks, unrelenting energy was aroused in me. Clear mindfulness was established. The body was unagitated and tranquil. The mind was concentrated and focused. Monks secluded from sensuality, secluded from unwholesome phenomena, I attained and remained in the first jhana." So next he goes into the standard descriptions of jhanas, so first, second, third, and fourth jhana. So this also is interesting because this sutta seems to be describing how one can start with doing certain kinds of insight practices. So in this case, reflecting on the harmfulness of unwholesome mind states and the helpfulness of wholesome mind states. So it's an insight meditation practice, evaluating the moral quality of the thoughts appearing in the mind. So how doing that kind of insight practice can provide the basis for samadhi, the basis for concentration and stabilization of mind. So he says he attained and remained in the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana. So I talk about jhana pretty often, so I'm not going to go into a detailed description of it at this time. If you want more on that topic, I recommend watching one of the previous talks I've given on jhana. I just gave one a few weeks ago, as I recall. So you can look back and see what I said about jhana at that time. Or you can check out the teachings of other teachers who talk about jhana. So Ajahn Brahm, Bhante Ji, those are two contemporary teachers who give very clear, helpful teachings about jhana. You can check them out as well. Briefly speaking, jhana are states of concentration where the mind has extremely stable mindfulness, so extremely sharp, clear awareness, but the mind is completely unified and still. So stillness of mind is one of the most important qualities of jhana practice, of concentration meditation. So the Buddha attains the 4 jhanas, and he says, when the mind was concentrated in this way, completely pure, clean, spotless, free of defilement, soft, flexible, stable, and imperturbable, I directed the mind towards recollection of past lives. And he says he recalled many past lives, that is 1 birth, 2 births, etc., up to 100,000 births, many eons of universal contraction, etc. So remembering not just his past life, but hundreds of thousands of past lives, and even more than that. So remembering many, many eons of past lives. So 1 eon is the lifespan of a universe. So that's somewhere in the domain of a few 100 billion years, which is a mind-bogglingly gigantic amount of time, which is pretty inconceivable for most of us. So the Buddha was remembering uncountable past lives, and remembering it in detail. So he says he remembered, there such was my name, my clan, my appearance, my food, my experience of pleasure and pain, and the ending of my lifespan. So in other words, he had clear, detailed memories of all of these billions of lives that he had lived before. And he says, when I fell from there, I rose over there. In other words, he remembered how he died and was reborn somewhere else. So remembering the transition between each of these lives as well. And he says, in this way I remember many past lives, in every characteristic in detail. And he says, monks, this is the first knowledge which I attained in the first portion of the night. Ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose, darkness was destroyed, light arose, as it is for one who dwells vigilant, ardent, and resolute. So, the knowledge of past lives, this is one of the abilities which every Buddha develops, and many arhants develop, but not necessarily all arhants have this kind of detailed recollection of past lives. Many do, but not all. But definitely all Buddhas develop this ability. And one reason why this is important is because it helps to give one a clear understanding of how karma works. And also it gives one a clear understanding of not-self. A clear understanding that whatever particular details we have in this life, it's irrelevant because in past lives we had completely different details. So maybe this life you're short and you think you're a short person. Well, you're not a short person. That just happens to be the current condition. You remember your past lives and you realize that sometimes you were short and sometimes you were tall and sometimes in between. Maybe this life you're female. Well, okay, fair enough. But you remember 100,000 past lives and you realize that about half of them you were male and about half of them you were female. So clearly, your gender doesn't define you either. And so on. Like whatever your current details are, whatever your current characteristics are, that's not you. Because over all these hundreds of thousands of lifetimes, you've experienced every imaginable characteristic, every imaginable kind of life, every imaginable kind of body, every imaginable kind of mind. So none of the details and characteristics that you currently have are actually your true self. None of them define you or control you. They're just temporary conditions. So the second knowledge, he says, when the mind was concentrated in this way, as before, I directed the mind towards knowledge of the death and rebirth of beings. So here, rather than just recollecting his own past lives, he's paying attention to how all beings die and are reborn according to their karma. So he says, with the divine eye, which is pure and surpasses human vision, I saw beings dying and being reborn. Inferior, superior, beautiful, ugly, fortunate, and unfortunate. I understood how beings fare according to their actions. So the word action here is karma. So in other words, he understands how people are reborn based upon their karma, and how they experience the world depending upon their karma. So he says, these honorable beings were endowed with bodily misconduct, verbal misconduct, and mental misconduct. They criticized noble ones, they held false perspectives, and they undertook actions based on false perspectives. After dying, when they were separated from their body, they arose in a state of deprivation, a bad destination, downfall in hell. In other words, people who engage in harmful actions get unpleasant experiences as a result. And the flip side, he says, however, these honorable beings were endowed with good bodily conduct, good verbal conduct, and good mental conduct. They did not criticize noble ones. So noble ones means people who have a high degree of spiritual purity. They had correct perspectives, that's right view, sammaditthi, and they undertook actions based on correct perspectives. After dying, when they were separated from their body, they arose in a good destination, a heavenly world. In other words, if you practice kindness and morality and generosity and wisdom, then you'll have pleasant experiences. You'll have a good rebirth and good experiences during that life. So he says, this is the second knowledge which I attained in the middle portion of the night. Ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose, darkness was destroyed, and light arose, as it is for one who dwells vigilant, ardent, and resolute. Then the third knowledge, the Buddha says, again, when his mind was concentrated, he says, I directed the mind towards knowledge of the elimination of the taints. So taints here is a translation of the word asava. So these days I usually translate asava as corruption. So the asavas are the corruptions of mind, which are the basis of defilement, the basis of both defilement and delusion. So the Buddha says, I directed the mind towards knowledge of the elimination of the taints. I accurately knew this is suffering. I accurately knew this is the source of suffering. I accurately knew this is the cessation of suffering. I accurately knew this is the practice which leads to the cessation of suffering. In other words, he knew for himself the Four Noble Truths. So this is also important because knowing the Four Noble Truths is the linchpin of awakening. So if you think you understand the Four Noble Truths, but you're not yet fully enlightened, then that means you don't yet understand the Four Noble Truths. You might have some intellectual idea of them, but you haven't yet fully internalized and comprehended the Four Noble Truths until you attain awakening. And he says, I accurately knew these are the taints. So in other words, he knew what defilement and delusion really is. And he knew the source of the taints, the cessation of the taints, and the practice which leads to the cessation of the taints. So clearly understanding how defilement and delusion arises in the mind, and also what we can do to eliminate all defilement and delusion. And he says, knowing in this way, seeing in this way, my mind was liberated from the taint of sensuality, from the taint of existence, and from the taint of ignorance. So the taint of sensuality and the taint of ignorance are pretty clear. The taint of existence means the desire to have some form of existence. Like, I want to be such and such. I want to be this, or I want to be that. So that's the taint of existence. It's called bhavasava. So the craving to be something. And the Buddha, he then announces his enlightenment. He says, when there was liberation, there was the knowledge liberated. I knew birth has been eliminated, the holy life has been lived. What was to be done has been done. There will be no further existence here. In other words, he recognized that he had attained freedom from birth and death, freedom from the cycle of samsara, freedom from the process of delusion. So freedom from all suffering. So he says, this is the third knowledge which I attained in the third portion of the night. Ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose, darkness was destroyed, light arose, as it is for one who dwells vigilant, ardent, and resolute. Then the Buddha ends the sutta with a simile. He says, monks, it is like a pond in a large valley in the forest, which has a large community of deer living in dependence on it. Some man might arise who desires their detriment, harm, and entrapment, so a deer hunter. He might close the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, open a false path, put in a decoy, and set up a distraction. In this way, monks, at a later occasion, that large community of deer might attain misfortune and disaster. However, monks, another might arise who desires their benefit, welfare, and security. He might open the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, close the false path, take away the decoy, and remove the distraction. In this way, monks, at a later occasion, that large community of deer might attain prosperity, growth, and abundance. So I find the simile cute in that you have the deer, and you have the deer hunter, but then you also have the opponent to the deer hunter, the person who is intentionally sabotaging the deer hunter's efforts. So I find this really, really adorable. This image of the person who's intentionally trying to sabotage the deer hunter. And the Buddha says, I have made this simile to demonstrate a meaning. And this is the meaning. A pond in a large valley in the forest is a designation for sensuality. A large community of deer is a designation for beings. A person who desires their detriment, harm, and entrapment is a designation for Mara, the evil one. So recently I gave a talk about Mara, the deceiver, the tempter, the one who tries to keep us trapped in samsara. He says, false path is a designation for the eightfold wrong path. That is, wrong view, wrong thought, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong concentration. That's what we're trying to not do. It says, decoy is a designation for delight and passion. Distraction is a designation for ignorance. And then he says, a person who desires their benefit, welfare, and security is a designation for the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one. In other words, for the Buddha. And he says, the safe, secure path that leads to bliss is a designation for the Noble Eightfold Path. That is, right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And he ends by saying, monks, I have opened the safe, secure path that leads to bliss, closed the false path, taken away the decoy, and removed the distraction. Monks, what is to be done out of compassion by a teacher who seeks the welfare of his disciples has been done by me for you. Monks, there are these tree roots, there are these empty buildings. Meditate, monks, do not be negligent. Do not be one who later falls into regret. This is my instruction for you. And the sutta ends, this is what the Blessed One said, satisfied those monks delighted in the Blessed One's speech. So that's the end of this sutta. So at this time we still have a few minutes. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and type in your questions, and Angela will read them out so I can answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhante, for those words of Dhamma. We have many, many friends in chat, as well as Bhante Sumita and Sam here at Empty Cloud. So I will look for questions. Anita asks, can you please share the Pali of whatever you frequently think about becomes your characteristic?
I think I already did give the Pali, but I'll say that again. So the Pali is bahulang, which means frequently. Anuvittaketi means to think about. Anuvichareti means to ponder or to dwell on. Tatatata means in that way. Nati means the tendency. Hoti, it is, and chetaso, of the mind. So bahulang anuvittaketi anuvichareti, whatever you frequently think about and ponder. Tatatata nati hoti chetaso. In that way, that will be the tendency of the mind. Okay?
And Pial and Indira ask, is this sutta essentially an expansion of Sama Sankappa versus Miccha Sankappa, right intention thought versus wrong intention thought?
Yeah, that's exactly what this is. Yeah.
And Jen asks, does the taint of existence include wanting to be enlightened?
Technically, yes. Yeah, technically true. But keep that one for now, because that one will help you eventually get rid of all the taints. Remember the simile of the raft. You don't let go of the raft until you reach the far shore. When you're in the middle of the river, you cling tightly to that raft because it's the only thing keeping you safe. So yes, it's technically true. The desire to attain enlightenment is a form of bhavasava, of bhavatanha, but it will help you eventually let go of bhavatanha. So don't worry about it too much. Don't worry about it at all. In fact, just keep striving for awakening.
Great. That's all the questions we have in chat. Do we have any questions here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you talked about having unwholesome thoughts outside of meditation can lead to unwholesome thoughts inside of meditation. I thought the music example was a good one. I was wondering about more subtle things like worrying, stuff like that. It feels like a bit of a two-way street. Like meditation can help with not thinking about it outside of meditation, but do you have any advice for how to think about those sorts of more subtle, unwholesome thoughts outside of meditation?
Yeah, basically try to have a mind of meditation at all times. So only think when you really need to. The thinking mind is a tool that you turn on when needed and leave off when you don't need it. Yeah, your thinking mind is like a chainsaw. It's a very powerful tool, but it's really dangerous to walk around with it running at full speed all the time. Like, just imagine you're going through your life like with a running chainsaw all the time. That's just crazy. You're going to get hurt, or you're going to hurt somebody else, or you're going to break something. Probably all of the above. But every once in a while, you need to cut a big piece of wood, and a chainsaw is perfect for that job. But most of the time, you don't need to have the chainsaw turned on. So it's the same with our thinking mind. Every once in a while, you need to analyze something and think about it and figure it out. So you turn on your thinking mind, you cut through whatever you need to do, and then you turn it off again. So as you're going throughout your day, as much as possible, try to maintain mindfulness, equanimity, and concentration.
We have one last question from Kumu. It says, Bhante, does the taint of to be not a taint when one is an arhat and wanting to be at a certain place, go to a certain place, say for a Dhamma talk or see someone, as that thought lacks craving?
So an arhat doesn't have bhavasava or bhavatanha. So an arhat doesn't have that anymore. It's completely gone. So an arhat doesn't have the thought of I am, or I want to be, or I will be. Those thoughts aren't present. They just are what they are. They're the remnant of their habits and tendencies from before awakening, but completely purified without any unwholesomeness. But there's no self-identity in there. As for wanting to go to a Dhamma talk and so on, that's part of the raft, as I said earlier. That's part of the commitment to Buddhist practice. It's part of the commitment to attaining awakening. So that's harmless. That's to be cultivated.
Great. So it is 9 a.m. I believe that is all the time that we have. So thank you again, Bhante Suddhaso. And thank you all for joining us and being a part of our community.
And we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.